Abandon the Road by Nicholas Sparks. Read and told by yours truly, Bosman Rosh. Chapter 1. On the morning of August 29th, 1988, a little more than 2 years after his wife had passed away, Miles Ryan stood on the back porch of his house, smoking a cigarette, watching as the rising sun slowly changed the morning sky from dusky gray to orange. Spread before him was the Trent River, its brackish waters particularly hidden by the cypress trees clustered at the water's edge. The smoke from Miles' cigarette swirled upwards, and he could feel the humidity rising, thickening the air. In time the birds began their morning song, the shrill whistles filling the air. A small bass boat passed by. The fisherman waved, and Miles acknowledged the gesture with a slight nod. It was all the energy he could summon. He needed a cup of coffee, a little java, and he'd feel ready enough to face the day. Getting Jonah off to school, keeping rein on the locals who flouted the law, posting eviction notices throughout the country, as well as handling whatever else inevitably cropped up, like meeting with Jonah's teacher later in that afternoon. And that was just for starters. The evening, if anything, seemed even busier. There was always so much to do, simply to keep the household running smoothly. Paying bills, shopping, clearing, repairing things around the house. Even in these rare moments when Miles found himself with a little free time on his hands, he felt as if he had to take advantage of it right away, or he'd lose the opportunity. Quickly, find something to read. Hurry up, there's only a few minutes to relax. Close your eyes. In a little while there won't be any time. It was enough to wear anyone down for a while, but what could he do about it? He really needed the coffee. The nicotine wasn't cutting it anymore, and he thought about throwing the cigarette out. But then it didn't matter whatever he did or not. In his mind, he didn't really smoke. Sure, he had a few cigarettes during the course of the day, but that wasn't really smoking. It wasn't as though he burned through a pack a day. And it wasn't as if he had been doing it his whole life either. He'd started after Missy had died, and he could stop any time he wanted. But why bother? Hell, his lungs were in good shape. Just last week he'd have to run after a shoplifter and had no trouble catching the kid. A smoker couldn't do that. Then again, it hasn't been easy, as if it was when he had been 20 years old. But that was 10 years ago, and even if 32 didn't mean it was time to start looking into nursing homes, he was getting older, and he could feel it too. There was a time during college when he and his friends would start their evening at 11 o'clock and proceed to stay out the rest of the night. In the last few years, except for those times he had been working, 11 o'clock was late, and if he had trouble falling asleep, he went to bed anyway. He couldn't imagine any reason strong enough to make him want to stay up. Exhaustion had become a permanent fixture in his life. Even on those nights when Jonah didn't have the nightmares. He'd been having them on and off ever since Missy died. Miles still awoke feeling tired, unfocused, sluggish, as if he were moving around underwater. Most of the time he attributed this to the hectic life he lived. But sometimes he wondered if there wasn't anything more serious wrong with him. He had read once that one of the symptoms of a clinical depression was undue lethargy without reason or cause. Of course he did have cause. What he really needed was some quiet time at a little beachfront cottage down in Key West, a place where he could fish for turbot or simply relax in a gentle swinging hammock while drinking a cold beer without facing any decisions more major than whether or not to wear sandals when he was walking on the beach with a nice woman at his side. That was part of it too, the loneliness. He was tired of being alone, of waking up in an empty bed, though the feeling still surprised him. He hadn't felt that way until recently. In the first year after Missy's death, Miles couldn't even begin to imagine loving another woman again. Ever. It was as if the urge for female companionship didn't exist at all. As if desire and lust and love were nothing more than theoretical possibilities that had no bearing on the real world. Even after he'd weathered shock and grief strong enough to make him cry every night, his life just felt wrong somehow, as if it were temporarily off track, but would soon right itself again. So there wasn't any reason to get too worked up about anything. Most things, after all, hadn't changed after the funeral. Bills kept coming. Jonah needed to eat. The grass needed to be mowed. He still had a job. Once, after too many beers, Charlie, his best friend and boss, had asked him what it was like to lose a wife, and Miles had told him that it didn't seem as if Missy were really gone. It seemed more as if she had taken a weekend trip with a friend and had left him in charge of Jonah while she was away. Time passed, and so eventually did the numbness he'd grown accustomed to. In its place, reality settled in. As much as he tried to move on, Miles still found his thoughts drawn to Missy. Everything, it seemed, reminded him of her, especially Jonah, who looked more like her the older he got. Sometimes when Miles stood in the doorway after tucking Jonah in, he could see his wife in the small features of his son's face, and he would have to turn away before Jonah could see the tears. But the image would stay with him for hours. He loved the way Missy had looked, as if she'd slept, her long brown hair spread across the pillow, one arm always resting above her head, her lips slightly parted, the subtle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, and her smell. That was something Miles would never forget. On the first Christmas morning after her death, while sitting in church, he'd caught a trace of the perfume that Missy used to wear, and he'd held on to the ache like a drowning man grasping a life preserver, until long after the service was over. He held on to other things as well. When they were first married, he and Missy used to have lunch at Fred and Clara's, a small restaurant just down the street from the bank where she worked. It was out of the way, quiet, and somehow its cozy embrace made them both feel as if nothing ever would change between them. They hadn't gone much once Jonah had been born, but Miles started going again once she was gone, as if hoping to find some remnant of those feelings still lingering on the panel walls. At home, too, he ran his life according to what she used to do. Since Missy had gone to the grocery store on Thursday evenings, that's when Miles went too. Because Missy liked to grow tomatoes along the side of the house, Miles grew them too. Missy had thought Lysol the best all-purpose kitchen cleaner, so he saw no reason to use anything else. Missy was always there, in everything he did. But sometime last spring, that feeling began to change. It came without warning, and Miles sensed it as soon as it happened. While driving downtown, he caught himself staring at a young couple walking hand in hand as they moved down the sidewalk. And for just a moment, Miles imagined himself as a man, and that the woman was with him. Or if not her, then someone who would love not only him, but Jonah as well. Someone who could make him laugh. Someone to share a bottle of wine with over a leisurely dinner. Someone to hold and touch, to whisper quietly with after the lights had gone off. Someone like Missy, he thought to himself, and her image immediately conjured up feelings of guilt and betrayal, overwhelming enough for him to banish the young couple from his mind forever. Or so he assumed. Later that night, right after crawling into bed, he thought himself thinking about them again. And though the feeling of guilt and betrayal were still there, they weren't as powerful as they had been earlier that day. And in that moment, Miles knew he'd taken the first step, albeit a small one, towards finally coming to terms with his loss. He began to justify his new reliability by telling himself that he was a widower now, that it was okay to have those feelings, and he knew no one would disagree with him. No one expected him to live the rest of his life alone. In the past few months, friends had even offered to set him up with a couple of dates. Besides, he knew that Missy would have wanted him to marry again. She'd said as much to him more than once. Like most couples, he'd played the what-if game. And though neither of them would ever expect anything terrible to happen, both had been in agreement that it wouldn't be right for Jonah to grow up with only a single parent. It wouldn't be right for the surviving spouse. Still, it seemed a little too soon. As the summer wore on, the thoughts about finding someone new began to surface more frequently and with more intensity. Missy was still there. Missy would always be there. Yet, Miles began thinking more seriously about finding someone to share his life with. Late at night, while comforting Jonah in the rocking chair out back, it was the only thing that seemed to help with the nightmares. The thoughts seemed strongest and always followed the same pattern. He probably could find someone to share his life with, eventually. But at this point, however, no matter how much he wanted it to be otherwise, his thoughts always still reverted back towards won't. The reason was in his bedroom. On his shelf, in a bulging manila envelope, sat the file concerning Missy's death, the one he'd made for himself in the months following the funeral. He kept it with him, as he wouldn't forget what happened. He kept it to remind him of the work he still had to do. He kept it to remind him of his failure.